I never expected that sharing a simple video of my daughter's first steps would spark the kind of tension that would upend my entire family. It was just a moment I wanted to celebrate, a milestone every parent cherishes. But the reaction I got from my stepmom changed everything. What started as a fleeting frustration quickly turned into a months-long battle of loyalty, truth, and the courage to stand up for what truly mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had always loved capturing every moment of my daughter Emma's early life. From the first smile to her tiny hands reaching out to grab my finger, my phone was practically a mini scrapbook filled with memories I wanted to hold on to forever, and I shared them freely with the people closest to me. I had a complicated family dynamic. My dad had remarried when Emma was just a few months old, and my stepmom, Carla, was technically part of our family, but she had always kept a noticeable distance from me and Emma. Carla never hid her indifference, whether in subtle gestures or curt remarks, and it stung more than I like to admit. She was polite enough in public, but behind closed doors, her words and actions often carried a sharp edge that made me feel unwelcome. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself that she just had her way of coping with the sudden changes in her life when my dad married me into hers. For a while, I tolerated the tension, telling myself that Emma deserved a peaceful home, even if I had to bite my tongue. The morning I recorded Emma taking her first steps was magical. She had been balancing on the couch and the coffee table for weeks, but that day she let go, wobbling uncertainly before collapsing into my arms, laughing with pure joy. I grabbed my phone, pressed record, and knew immediately that this was one of those memories I had to share. I sent the video to a small group chat with my dad, my best friend, and, of course, Carla. I expected a simple, cheerful response, maybe a congratulations or an emoji reaction. But what I got instead made my heart sink. Carla replied with a single sentence, "Glad I don't have to watch that." My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I read her message again, wondering if I had misinterpreted it, if perhaps there was some hidden sarcasm I couldn't detect through text. But there was no doubt. Her words were deliberate, cold, and cutting. A wave of hurt and anger surged through me, but I forced myself to respond politely, my voice unsteady in my mind as I typed out a neutral reply and hit send. In the hours that followed, I replayed that moment over and over in my head, analyzing every word, every possible hidden meaning. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but the sting of rejection was undeniable. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't the first time Carla had made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Small comments about how Emma might be better off learning from someone else, dismissive sighs when I spoke about milestones, and the way she barely looked at Emma during family gatherings all painted a pattern I could no longer ignore. But confronting her was terrifying. She had a sharp tongue and a reputation for stirring conflict in the household, and my dad often took her side, unintentionally or otherwise. The thought of a family rift kept me silent, but that silence came with a growing sense of frustration and injustice. Over the next few days, I noticed the subtle shifts in Carla's behavior. At breakfast, she would glance at Emma with barely concealed disinterest. She would make passing remarks about responsibilities and priorities that seemed to design to imply that Emma's milestones were trivial. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, as if any misstep might provoke another harsh response. Meanwhile, my dad remained blissfully unaware of the depth of tension between Carla and me, often chuckling at what he perceived as harmless banter. It was maddening. I began documenting the exchanges, noting times, dates, and exact words, more out of a need to understand the pattern than to prove anything to anyone. Yet with each passing day, the emotional weight grew heavier and my instinct to protect Emma from witnessing the hostility strengthened. I wanted to shield her from the conflict, to preserve her sense of joy and safety, but I also knew I couldn't keep hiding my feelings forever. That week, I decided to continue sharing Emma's moments selectively, sending videos to my close circle of friends who truly appreciated her growth. I avoided sending anything to Carla, yet the tension in the household became palpable. I started noticing her watching from a distance whenever I played videos for my dad, her eyes narrow, lips pressed tightly together, a subtle scowl forming as if she couldn't understand why anyone would celebrate a child's achievement with such fervor. It was a quiet cruelty.
the type that digs into your soul slowly and leaves a mark without ever making a loud scene. Friends who came over noticed it too, exchanging awkward glances when Carla would mutter a dismissive comment under her breath. I felt increasingly trapped in a home that was supposed to be safe and nurturing, but instead seemed filled with silent judgment.
Then came a weekend when my dad had to travel for work, leaving Carla, Emma, and me alone at the house. I thought maybe we could bridge the gap, make a small effort toward connection by showing her a video of Emma attempting a new word or giggling uncontrollably at peekaboo. I hesitated, wondering if it would be received with more warmth or if the previous coldness would only intensify. But when I sent the clip, the response was the same. A curt, dismissive remark, delivered without any attempt at empathy. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed and listened to her gentle breathing, I realized that this wasn't just about hurt feelings. It was about standing up to a pattern of indifference that threatened to undermine the joy of my daughter's early childhood. I knew I had to find a way to confront the situation, not in anger, but in a way that revealed the truth of what Emma and I were experiencing. The decision weighed heavily, knowing that it would change family dynamics and possibly put me at odds with my dad. But for Emma's sake, I understood that silence was no longer an option. By the end of that first week, I had made a choice. I would not let dismissive cruelty overshadow Emma's milestones, and I would find a way to make the family, and Carla, acknowledge the joy she was bringing into the world. Little did I know, the path I was about to embark on would reveal layers of deception, hidden loyalties, and unexpected allies, and would ultimately test my courage in ways I never imagined. It was a simple video that started it all, a moment meant to be shared with love, yet it had become the spark that would ignite a journey none of us would ever forget. The days that followed Carla's dismissive comment only deepened the unease in the house, and I found myself constantly on edge, watching every interaction between her and Emma with a mix of anxiety and quiet determination. Each milestone Emma reached became a test of my patience and resolve, as if the universe had conspired to see how far I would go to protect my daughter from someone who should have cared. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, keeping the routines of breakfast, playtime, and bedtime consistent, but the tension was like a low hum that never faded, present in every glance and every word exchanged. I couldn't help but notice that Emma, though oblivious to the emotional undercurrents, sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Her normally carefree laughter sometimes faltered when Carla walked into the room, and her little brow would furrow in a way that made my heart ache. I realized then that this wasn't just about me feeling rejected or hurt. It was about the subtle ways a child absorbs the emotional climate around her, and I felt a profound responsibility to shield her from it as much as possible. I began reflecting on the history of Carla's behavior, trying to piece together a pattern that could explain her repeated indifference. My dad had always been a kind man, generous and protective, but his tendency to avoid confrontation allowed Carla's subtle hostility to flourish unchecked. I remembered family dinners where she would make passive remarks that undermined my role as a parent, where she would insist on correcting me in front of Emma over trivial matters, and where her smirks carried an unmistakable sense of superiority. For a long time, I had dismissed these moments as inconsequential, chalking them up to adjustment issues or differences in personality. But now, looking back, I could see that they were consistent indicators of a broader pattern. Carla's behavior was strategic, carefully measured, and aimed at maintaining a position of dominance in the household. The realization sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just personal hurt I was dealing with. It was a subtle, calculated undermining of the family dynamic that impacted Emma's early childhood and my sense of authority as her parent. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
At first, I tried subtle approaches, small attempts to engage Carla in shared joy with Emma. I would send her short clips of Emma stacking blocks, drawing with crayons, or babbling in her adorable attempts at new words. I watched her closely, hoping for a glimmer of warmth or engagement, but her responses remained minimal and detached. There was no excitement, no encouragement, and the few times she made a comment, it was either sarcastic or dismissive. I began documenting these interactions, not as an act of revenge, but as a way to track the emotional climate and understand whether there was any hope of reconciliation. The notes became detailed records of dates, times, exact words, and subtle gestures, building a picture of ongoing indifference and quiet antagonism. I knew that evidence alone would not change hearts, but it might create the foundation for a confrontation that was grounded in clarity rather than emotion. Meanwhile, Emma continued to grow and explore, her curiosity and joy undiminished by the household tension, and I felt both pride and dread. Pride for the little human she was becoming unshaken in her innocence and joy, and dread for the reality she might one day sense the undercurrent of rejection in our home. I began spending extra time capturing her milestones, creating small video compilations that celebrated her development, and sharing them selectively with family members who had shown genuine interest in her life.
Each time I sent a video, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, wondering if Carla would respond, what she might say, and how the interaction would affect my own emotional state. The anticipation became almost unbearable, as if each video sent was a test I was being forced to take, with Emma's emotional world unknowingly hanging in the balance. As weeks passed, the tension in the home became more pronounced. Carla's presence was a constant, quiet force that shaped the rhythm of daily life. I noticed her avoiding eye contact with Emma during play, sitting in distant corners during meals, and making subtle remarks about parenting choices that were laced with judgment. These small actions accumulated, creating a pervasive sense of discomfort and unease. I found myself walking a fine line between maintaining peace for Emma's sake and asserting my right to share in her joy without interference. It was emotionally exhausting, and I began to feel the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on me, leaving little room for relaxation or genuine connection within the household. One evening, I decided to take a step I had avoided for months. I spoke to my father about Carla's behavior, presenting my observations in a calm, factual manner. I showed him some of the notes I had been keeping, hoping to convey the seriousness of the situation without turning it into an emotional confrontation. He listened, visibly uncomfortable, and promised to keep an eye on things. But his lack of decisive action left me frustrated and concerned. I realized then that relying solely on him to mediate the situation would not be sufficient. The responsibility to protect Emma and assert boundaries was falling squarely on my shoulders. This recognition, while daunting, ignited a sense of determination within me. I knew I had to take proactive steps, not out of anger, but out of necessity to safeguard the emotional well-being of my daughter and preserve the moments of joy that were her right as a growing child. Around this time, I began confiding in close friends and family outside the household, seeking advice and perspective. Their reactions were a mix of sympathy, concern, and encouragement, and their support became a lifeline. They reminded me that my feelings were valid, that the pattern of indifference and subtle hostility was not something to ignore, and that I had every right to advocate for Emma and myself. I also began researching strategies for managing difficult family dynamics, focusing on methods that emphasized calm communication, clear boundaries, and the careful documentation of interactions. Slowly, I started forming a plan for how to address the growing tension with Carla directly, knowing that avoidance could no longer protect Emma or preserve the joy of her early milestones. By the end of this period, I had come to a sobering realization. The small, dismissive comment about Emma's first steps was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a deeper pattern.
Carla's indifference was intentional, and it had been quietly shaping the emotional landscape of our household for months. Recognizing this pattern was painful, but it also provided clarity. I could no longer ignore the subtle undermining or hope that time alone would change things. If I wanted Emma to grow up in a home where her achievements were celebrated and her joy protected, I had to confront the situation, gather undeniable evidence of the ongoing behavior, and be prepared to assert my voice, even if it meant facing resistance or conflict within the family. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon, an ordinary day that would unexpectedly mark the beginning of a shift in our family dynamic. I had just finished recording Emma attempting to stack her favorite set of wooden blocks, a small triumph she had been practicing for weeks. Her laughter filled the living room as the top block wobbled precariously before finally falling into place, and I knew this was another moment I needed to capture. Feeling a mix of pride and nostalgia, I decided to compile a short video and share it with my father and Carla, hoping, perhaps naively, that this time the response would be warmer. My fingers hovered over the send button, a subtle knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. The previous exchanges with Carla had left a scar of doubt in my mind, but I still hoped for at least a moment of acknowledgement. When the message went through, I immediately regretted the anticipatory worry, knowing her response could either brighten my day or plunge me back into frustration. Minutes passed, and then the reply came. Carla's words were short, sharp, and devastatingly indifferent. "I really don't see why I need to watch this." I felt a cold shock ripple through me as I read the message. Her tone was dismissive, not just indifferent, but almost deliberately cruel, as if she were asserting that Emma's joy had no significance to her at all. My hands trembled slightly as I put the phone down and stared at Emma, who was blissfully unaware of the tension, crawling towards me with a squeal of delight. The contrast between her innocence and the harshness of Carla's message hit me with full force. For the first time, I felt the weight of what this pattern of behavior might mean for Emma if it continued unchecked. I realized that this was no longer a matter of polite tolerance or awkward coexistence. This was a moment that demanded action, a turning point where silence and avoidance would no longer suffice.
In that moment, I made a conscious decision to act, not out of anger, but out of necessity to protect Emma and preserve the sense of joy that every milestone should carry. I started by reviewing the growing collection of video clips, texts, and observations I had been documenting over the past few weeks. Each clip of Emma's smiling, laughing, and achieving something new was juxtaposed against Carla's repeated expressions of disinterest or subtle contempt. The pattern was undeniable. The evidence revealed a consistent and intentional dismissal of my daughter's achievements, a behavior that was slowly eroding the positive energy in our home. I felt a mixture of fear and determination, knowing that confronting this issue would not be easy, but understanding that it was critical to do so before the emotional toll on Emma became significant. That afternoon, I decided to share one of the videos with a trusted friend, someone who had been following the situation closely and could provide an objective perspective. I wanted a neutral reaction, a sense of whether my concerns were valid or whether I was overreacting to what might be seen as minor familial tension. The response I received was immediate and supportive. My friend could see the joy in Emma and the stark contrast in Carla's dismissive attitude. They encouraged me to continue documenting interactions and to consider involving my father in a more structured conversation about the situation. Their validation was both comforting and empowering, reinforcing the belief that this was not merely a personal grievance, but a matter that could impact Emma's emotional well-being if left unaddressed. Over the next few days, I became more vigilant in observing Carla's behavior. I noted moments when she would avoid eye contact during Emma's play, subtle sighs or muttered remarks that undermined the positivity in the household, and times when she would deliberately ignore my daughter's calls for attention. Each observation strengthened my resolve to take action. I realized that these behaviors, though seemingly small in isolation, collectively formed a pattern of emotional neglect that could have long-term consequences for Emma's development and self-esteem. The situation was no longer something I could passively endure. It was an
urgent matter that required careful strategy, documentation, and eventually confrontation. One afternoon, as I reviewed another batch of video clips for evidence, I noticed something that made my heart sink and simultaneously steel my determination. Carla had been subtly interfering in Emma's play, redirecting her attention away from her accomplishments and making small, almost imperceptible comments designed to diminish the significance of her achievements. It was a calculated pattern, repeated often enough to suggest intent rather than coincidence. The realization hit me with a mixture of horror and clarity. This was not simply indifference or personality clash. This was an active undermining of my role as a parent and, more importantly, a threat to Emma's emotional security. I felt a surge of responsibility, an undeniable call to intervene before these patterns became ingrained or normalized for Emma. The next step was delicate. I had to consider how to involve my father without framing the situation as a personal attack against Carla, while still ensuring that the truth of her behavior was understood. I began drafting a careful record of interactions, organizing videos chronologically, noting Carla's comments and actions, and highlighting moments that clearly demonstrated indifference or emotional neglect. This process was painstaking and emotionally exhausting, but I understood that without a clear record, my concerns could easily be dismissed as overreaction or misinterpretation. I wanted to ensure that when the time came to address the situation, I could present an irrefutable account that focused on protecting Emma rather than assigning blame. By the end of that week, the weight of the situation pressed on me constantly. Every interaction with Carla became a careful negotiation. Every shared moment with Emma, a delicate balance between joy and vigilance. Yet, despite the emotional exhaustion, I felt a sense of empowerment forming. The decision to act, to document, and to prepare for confrontation marked the first real step toward reclaiming a sense of agency in the household. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, that it would test my patience, courage, and determination. But I also understood that for Emma's sake, it was necessary. The seemingly small video of her stacking blocks had become more than a simple memory. It had become the catalyst for a journey that would challenge the dynamics of our family, reveal hidden truths, and ultimately demand the courage to protect the joy and innocence of a child. The moment I realized that the situation had reached a point of no return came quietly, almost imperceptibly, during an ordinary Wednesday evening. I had been compiling a collection of Emma's milestones, carefully organizing the videos and written notes I had been gathering over weeks, when my father walked in and asked to see what I'd been working on. For the first time, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. I knew that showing him the compiled evidence might finally draw his attention to what I had been trying to communicate for so long. As I handed him my phone and started playing the clips in sequence, I watched closely for his reaction. Emma's laughter, her first words, the moments when she discovered new textures and sounds all played out in vivid detail, a testament to her curiosity and joy. My father's expressions shifted gradually, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a pause that spoke volumes. He had never seemed aware of the pattern I had been noticing, and now the reality of Carla's consistent indifference could no longer be ignored.
As the final clip ended, showing Emma wobbling unsteadily on her little legs before collapsing into my arms with a victorious giggle, I looked to my father for a sign of acknowledgement. For the first time, he seemed to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, the repeated dismissals, the subtle undermining that had gone unnoticed for months. I explained, calmly and clearly, how Carla had responded to each video, the way she had consistently distanced herself from Emma's milestones, and the emotional weight this behavior could carry for a child so young. I presented the notes I had been keeping, the chronological record of dismissive comments, the small gestures of indifference, and the ways her presence had affected the overall atmosphere in the home. For the first time,
My father saw the evidence not as minor grievances or exaggerated perceptions, but as a consistent pattern that required immediate attention. The clarity this brought was both relieving and terrifying. On one hand, I felt validated, finally understood, and less alone in navigating the emotional landscape of our household. On the other hand, I realized that taking action against Carla's behavior would inevitably provoke conflict. She was sharp, protective of her position in the family, and skilled at deflecting criticism. Confronting her would not be easy, and I could anticipate defensive reactions, attempts to shift blame, and potentially even attempts to manipulate the narrative to maintain her image. Yet, despite these fears, the decision had been made. The point of no return had been crossed. Silence and avoidance were no longer options. Emma's well-being and the integrity of our family dynamic demanded intervention. Over the next few days, I prepared carefully, aware that approaching the situation without strategy could backfire. I continued to collect evidence, not only from videos and messages, but from day-to-day observations, capturing moments when Carla minimized Emma's excitement, subtly redirected her attention, or dismissed her achievements in ways that were emotionally harmful. Each note and clip was cataloged, organized, and labeled with dates, times, and context. It was a meticulous process, demanding attention to detail, but it provided a sense of control in a situation that had previously felt chaotic and disheartening. I understood that confronting Carla without clear evidence would leave me vulnerable to accusations of overreaction or emotional instability. Documentation was my shield, my tool for ensuring that the truth could not be ignored or twisted. I also began consulting with friends who had experience navigating complex family dynamics. Their advice was invaluable, offering perspectives I hadn't considered and strategies for maintaining calm while asserting boundaries. They emphasized the importance of keeping the focus on Emma's well-being, presenting observations objectively, and avoiding personal attacks that could escalate tension. I realized that this was not merely a confrontation, it was an opportunity to create accountability, to set standards for how children should be treated in the home, and to ensure that Emma's experiences were validated and respected. This reframing gave me additional confidence, reinforcing the idea that my actions were not motivated by resentment or personal conflict, but a moral responsibility to protect the emotional and psychological health of my child. The night before I planned to present the compiled evidence to my father, I felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve. I went through each clip again, replaying Emma's laughter, her small victories, and the moments of discovery that highlighted the contrast between her innocence and Carla's dismissive behavior. The weight of responsibility was heavy. I understood that the confrontation could trigger defensiveness, emotional backlash, or even temporary estrangement within the household. Yet, the risk of inaction far outweighed the discomfort of confrontation. The clarity of purpose provided a sense of calm determination. I was no longer simply documenting moments or venting frustrations. I was preparing to bring hidden truths to light, to challenge patterns of neglect, and to advocate for Emma's right to experience joy unimpeded by indifference. When I finally presented the evidence, my father's reaction was immediate and intense, though not confrontational. He asked questions, sought clarification, and began connecting the dots between the videos, my notes, and the subtle shifts in family interactions he had previously overlooked. The process was painstakingly detailed, but it was also transformative. My father began to see the emotional environment of the household through a lens he had never considered, recognizing that Carla's behavior was not trivial or harmless, but a series of deliberate choices that undermined our family dynamic and impacted Emma's early emotional development. The realization was sobering, but it marked the beginning of a shift. For the first time, the possibility of accountability, change, and acknowledgement emerged as tangible prospects. By the end of that week, it was clear that the dynamics in the house had irrevocably shifted. Carla's dismissive behaviors could no longer be ignored or minimized, and the path forward required deliberate confrontation, careful boundary setting, and ongoing advocacy for Emma's well-being. The point of no return had been crossed, and the story of our family had entered a new chapter, one in which truth would begin to take shape and patterns of indifference would be challenged. What had started as a simple video of Emma's first steps had ignited a journey of awareness, documentation, and moral courage, setting the stage for the revelations, conflicts, and transformations yet to come. With my father now aware of the situation, the next challenge was navigating the rising tension and opposition that inevitably followed. Carla, whether consciously or subconsciously, began to sense that something had shifted in the household. The unsubtle, quiet indifference she had displayed towards Emma and I now seemed to be met with heightened awareness and a certain vigilance. Every interaction became a careful negotiation, a test of patience, and an exercise in restraint.
I quickly realized that this was not going to be resolved through polite reminders or passive observation. The subtle undermining had evolved into a quiet opposition, a force that seemed determined to resist accountability and maintain control over the emotional tone of the home. I had to act strategically, gathering objective evidence that would make it impossible for anyone to dismiss the pattern of behavior. I began documenting interactions even more meticulously, noting the precise timing, tone, and context of every dismissive remark or exclusionary behavior. Each morning, I would write down observations from the day before, how Carla reacted or failed to react when Emma reached for a toy, how she ignored milestones while I recorded them, and the subtle gestures of disinterest that spoke louder than words. I also started compiling video evidence, not just of Emma's achievements, but of Carla's interactions, or lack thereof, to illustrate the contrast clearly. There were moments when she actively diverted Emma's attention, picking up a phone or changing the conversation topic as Emma attempted to share her excitement. Other times, she would make seemingly innocuous comments that subtly undermined my authority as a parent, telling Emma that her accomplishments were not that important, or that she should focus on other things. Each recorded instance reinforced the pattern, transforming what might have seemed like isolated incidents into an undeniable, continuous narrative of neglect and emotional distance. As the documentation progressed, I noticed my own feelings intensifying. The initial frustration had grown into a deeper emotional struggle, anger at the repeated indifference, fear of the impact on Emma, and a profound determination to protect her joy. It was exhausting to maintain the vigilance required to observe and record every interaction, but I understood that without this effort, the truth would remain hidden and the cycle would continue. The work was isolating. I could no longer casually relax in the home without scanning the room for potential dismissive behavior or subtle manipulations. Every smile, every shared moment now carried an undercurrent of tension, as if I were simultaneously celebrating Emma's milestones and documenting a silent battle. Carl's behavior also began to escalate subtly, though not overtly. I noticed small shifts in her interactions that suggested an awareness of scrutiny. She would sometimes offer brief, half-hearted acknowledgments of Emma's achievements, only to quickly withdraw or redirect attention elsewhere. There were times when she made seemingly innocuous comments that subtly undermined my authority as a parent, telling Emma that her accomplishments were not that important or that she should focus on other things. Each recorded instance reinforced the pattern, transforming what might have seemed like isolated incidents into an undeniable continuous narrative of neglect and emotional distance. During this period, I also sought outside perspectives to validate my observations and strengthen my resolve. I shared discrete clips with trusted friends and relatives, asking for honest assessments of Carla's behavior. Their reactions were consistent and illuminating. They saw the same patterns I had documented: the deliberate avoidance, the subtle undermining, and the persistent disinterest. Their support became essential, not only for validation, but for strategic guidance.
They advised that the focus remain on Emma's well-being, that the evidence be presented in a factual, chronological manner, and that I maintain composure even in the face of potential hostility. This external reinforcement bolstered my confidence and clarified that my mission was not personal revenge, but the protection of a child's emotional environment. As the weeks went by, the tension in the household felt increasingly high. I began noticing the emotional impact on Emma, subtle though it was. She remained largely cheerful and curious, but occasionally her laughter would falter when Carla entered the room, and she seemed to pause as if anticipating criticism or dismissal. The contrast between Emma's natural joy and the tension in her environment underscored the urgency of addressing the situation. Each moment of observation reinforced the reality that this was not a minor family disagreement, but a systemic pattern of emotional neglect that required intervention. My role was no longer passive. I was the guardian of both evidence and emotional well-being, balancing documentation with the daily demands of nurturing a young child. The rising opposition also began to manifest in ways that were more strategic than overt. Carla started scrutinizing my interactions with Emma, questioning my choices with a thin veneer of concern, and attempting to frame my actions as overly sensitive or unnecessary. These challenges required careful navigation. I could not allow the subtle undermining to escalate into a narrative in which I appeared irrational or overly dramatic. It became a test of composure, requiring a meticulous combination of observation, documentation, and strategic communication. The process was emotionally taxing, yet necessary, as it created a record that would later serve as the foundation for confronting the behavior and ensuring accountability. By the end of this phase, the tension in the household had solidified. Carla's subtle opposition was evident, objective evidence was accumulating, and the stakes for Emma's emotional well-being were higher than ever. I understood that the next steps would involve making undeniable revelations, presenting concrete proof, and navigating confrontations that could fundamentally alter the family dynamic. The process of gathering evidence was no longer simply a preparation. It was a rising action in a story that demanded courage, strategy, and resilience. Every recorded video, every note, every careful observation was a building block toward the moment when truth would become unavoidable and the long-hidden patterns of indifference could no longer be ignored or excused.
The day that changed everything arrived quietly, without fanfare, in the middle of a routine afternoon, yet it carried with it the weight of undeniable proof that could no longer be ignored. I had been compiling the evidence meticulously for weeks, carefully organizing video clips, written observations, and timestamps of Carla's subtle dismissals and emotional distance toward Emma. Each entry had been a small accumulation of frustration, fear, and hope that eventually someone, my father, a family member, or even Carla herself, would recognize the pattern and the emotional impact it was having on a child too young to defend herself. I didn't anticipate that the undeniable proof would come from a source so ordinary yet so revealing, the home security camera footage that my father had recently installed in the living room. He had insisted it was purely for monitoring Emma's safety while he was at work, but the video ended up capturing far more than I had anticipated. One afternoon, while reviewing the footage to ensure Emma's play area was secure, I noticed a sequence of interactions that immediately caught my attention. Emma was playing with her blocks, her face lit with joy as she stacked them carefully, wobbling slightly before she toppled them over and laughed. I watched Carla walk into the room, her expression neutral at first, and then gradually morphing into the familiar mask of disinterest I had grown accustomed to. What the camera captured was even more revealing than what I had experienced in person. Carla barely glanced at Emma, made a subtle scoff, and then deliberately redirected the child's attention to an unrelated task, a cup of water on the counter, as if Emma's achievement were insignificant. The footage continued for several minutes, documenting a pattern of behavior that I had suspected but could now see clearly, objectively, and indisputably.
The realization hit me with a mix of shock and clarity. Here was a concrete, visual record that left no room for denial. The way Carla had subtly manipulated Emma's attention, dismissed her excitement, and minimized her joy was undeniable. Every previous note, text, and video I had documented suddenly took on new weight in the context of this footage. It was no longer a matter of subjective interpretation or emotional bias. The evidence spoke for itself. I felt a mix of relief, validation, and a surge of responsibility. The truth was no longer abstract. It was tangible, visible, and irrefutable. This was the moment where I understood that the story could no longer be contained in private frustration or whispered observations. The hidden truth had emerged, and the emotional stakes of our household were about to be confronted directly. I immediately began reviewing all prior clips and observations in conjunction with the security footage, cross-referencing moments to build a comprehensive picture. Each instance of dismissive behavior, each subtle act of undermining, was now supported by visual evidence. I noticed small patterns I had previously overlooked. The way Carla would subtly shift her gaze away when Emma sought attention, the quiet sighs that punctuated minor achievements, and the half-hearted attempts at acknowledgement that immediately dissolved into distraction. It became clear that this behavior was deliberate and consistent, not occasional or accidental. The footage provided a level of objectivity that made the pattern impossible to dispute. The power of this evidence was not just in its clarity, but in the emotional impact it carried. Watching Emma's unfiltered joy, juxtaposed against Carla's calculated indifference, created a visceral emotional response that reinforced the urgency of the situation. I felt a renewed sense of determination to confront the behavior and protect Emma's emotional well-being. At the same time, I understood that presenting this evidence would require careful consideration, as Carla's defensive nature could easily lead to denial, deflection, or manipulation if approached without strategy. The footage had given me proof, but it had also illuminated the complexity of the confrontation that lay ahead. I decided to share the footage with my father first, knowing that his acknowledgement and support would be essential in any subsequent steps. As he watched the clips, I could see the recognition dawning in his expression. For the first time, he fully grasped the subtlety and consistency of Carla's behavior, seeing not only the surface-level interactions, but also the emotional patterns that had been eroding the household's positive environment. The footage provided him with a perspective he had previously lacked, clarifying the reality that this was not simply a matter of personal disagreement or minor tension, but a consistent pattern of emotional neglect that required immediate attention. Once my father and I had thoroughly reviewed the footage, we began discussing how to address the situation. The undeniable proof had changed the dynamic entirely. There was no room for dismissal or rationalization. Carla could no longer claim ignorance or mistake, and any further attempts to minimize her behavior would be clearly contradicted by objective evidence. The discussion with my father focused on strategy, how to confront the behavior without escalating conflict unnecessarily, how to protect Emma's emotional experience in the process, and how to ensure that the evidence would be used constructively rather than punitively. It was a delicate balance requiring thoughtfulness, planning, and an unwavering commitment to Emma's well-being. Over the following days, I noticed subtle shifts in Carla's behavior, as if she sensed the growing scrutiny. She became more careful in her interactions, occasionally offering minimal acknowledgement, though still lacking genuine engagement. The presence of objective evidence changed the stakes. Any future dismissal could no longer be ignored or rationalized, and the power dynamics in the household were beginning to shift. For me, the major revelation brought a sense of both empowerment and responsibility. I now had the tools to protect Emma and advocate for her emotional needs, and I understood that the truth, once visible, had the power to transform our family dynamic in ways that were long overdue.
By the end of this period, the undeniable proof had shifted the trajectory of our story.
Carla's subtle indifference, once a hidden force, was now exposed and documented. The stage was set for confrontation, accountability, and eventual change. Emma's milestones were no longer invisible, and the quiet undermining that had previously gone unnoticed could finally be addressed. The revelation was not just about documenting a problem, it was about creating a path toward validation, acknowledgement, and a healthier emotional environment for my daughter. The moment I decided to finally speak up arrived with a mix of apprehension and resolve, a culmination of weeks of observation, documentation, and emotional processing. The undeniable footage and corroborating notes had made it impossible to ignore the pattern any longer. It was no longer a matter of hoping for change or gently nudging Carla toward engagement. The emotional well-being of my daughter demanded action, and the responsibility rested squarely on my shoulders. That evening, I sat down in the living room with my father and reviewed the compiled evidence one final time, internalizing the sequence of dismissals, subtle undermining, and emotional neglect that had accumulated over weeks. I felt a surge of protectiveness for Emma, combined with a gnawing anxiety about the confrontation that lay ahead. This was not a decision I made lightly. The ramifications could ripple through the family, alter relationships, and create tension that might take months to heal. What gave me courage in that moment was the clarity of purpose. Every video clip of Emma's achievements, every note detailing Carla's indifference, and every documented interaction formed a narrative that could no longer be denied or minimized. It was objective, undeniable, and centered entirely on the child's experience. The choice to speak was not born of anger or spite. It was a deliberate act to advocate for Emma's right to be celebrated, to be nurtured, and to experience joy without dismissal. I realized that I had reached a point where silence was no longer morally or emotionally tenable. To continue protecting the hidden truth would be to tacitly accept the repeated pattern of emotional neglect. The moment had arrived to confront the situation head-on, to stop protecting the behavior and instead champion the well-being of my daughter. I began preparing for the confrontation by considering how to present the evidence in a way that was factual, organized, and difficult to dispute. The strategy was clear: focus on Emma's experiences rather than Carla's intentions. Use visual proof and chronological records to illustrate the pattern, and avoid emotional accusations that could trigger defensiveness. I rehearsed explanations for each clip, ensuring that the narrative emphasized the impact on Emma rather than personal grievances. The goal was to make the behavior visible, undeniable, and actionable, so that any further dismissal or deflection would be impossible. I understood that the confrontation would test not only my composure, but also the willingness of my father to enforce boundaries and protect Emma's emotional space. The day I finally confronted Carla was tense from the moment she entered the room. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation I could feel, but she perhaps could not perceive. I presented the evidence calmly, methodically, and with a focus on Emma's well-being. Every video, note, and observation was laid out to show a consistent pattern of emotional neglect and dismissal. The clips of Emma's joy juxtaposed against Carla's indifference were particularly powerful, illustrating the invisible emotional chasm that had been widening over time. For the first time, the dismissive mask Carla had worn for months was challenged directly by objective proof, and the reaction was immediate. Her attempts to justify or rationalize were evident, yet the evidence made it impossible for her to deny the behavior entirely. As the confrontation unfolded, I could feel the emotional weight of weeks of tension lifting slightly, replaced with a mixture of anxiety and relief. Speaking the truth, presenting the objective evidence, and refusing to allow further dismissals was both exhausting and empowering. The conversation revealed the true dynamics of the household, forcing each participant to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. Carla's defensiveness surfaced, but it was tempered by the undeniable clarity of the evidence, which prevented the narrative from being twisted or dismissed. For the first time, the hidden pattern was exposed to scrutiny, and the responsibility to respond fell squarely on those who had previously overlooked or minimized the behavior. Through this process, I also witnessed a subtle but profound shift in my father's perspective. Having been a quiet observer until this point, he now recognized the significance of the evidence and the necessity of intervention. His support provided both practical reinforcement and emotional validation, confirming that the confrontation was not just about challenging Carla, but about reshaping the environment to prioritize the well-being and joy of a young child. The aftermath of this confrontation was a delicate balance. While the initial reaction from Carla included defensiveness and subtle attempts at deflection, the undeniable nature of the evidence limited her ability to continue the previous patterns without scrutiny. I remained vigilant, continuing to document interactions and monitor the household atmosphere. Each subsequent moment of engagement, or lack thereof, was now contextualized within a framework of accountability. I was no longer operating in uncertainty. The choice to speak had created a new baseline for expectations and responsibilities. Every video clip, note, and observation now held the power to influence change and reinforce boundaries that prioritized Emma's emotional needs.
By the end of this period, I felt a profound sense of responsibility and empowerment. The choice to speak, to present the evidence, and to insist on accountability had irrevocably changed the household dynamic. The hidden truth was no longer silent. It had been revealed, documented, and confronted. While tension and challenges remained, the path forward was now illuminated by clarity and purpose. Emma's milestones were no longer ignored, and her joy had advocates actively working to protect and celebrate it. The decision to speak had transformed the situation from passive observation into active intervention, setting the stage for the confrontation with resistance, the emotional lows, and ultimately the vindication that lay ahead in the story. After the confrontation, the household entered a period of heightened tension, an invisible pressure that seemed to permeate every interaction. Carla, previously subtle in her dismissal and indifference, now became overt in her resistance, testing boundaries and seeking to reassert control over the emotional narrative of the home. She was no longer merely passive. Her actions began to feel deliberate, an attempt to undermine the progress that had been made since the presentation of undeniable evidence. It was as if the exposure of her behavior had triggered a defensive mechanism, one aimed at reclaiming authority and diminishing the legitimacy of my advocacy. The atmosphere became charged with a quiet intensity, each interaction weighted with the potential for conflict or emotional escalation. I quickly realized that this was the second pinch point in our story, the stage where opposition became tangible, persistent, and increasingly challenging. The mounting pressure manifested in subtle, yet powerful ways. Carla would frequently question my decisions, particularly around Emma's routines, meals, and playtime, framing them as unnecessary or excessive. At times, she would openly criticize my approach, attempting to inject doubt or hesitation into decisions that were in Emma's best interest. Even more insidious were the moments when she redirected attention away from Emma's achievements, making small jokes, undermining celebrations, or minimizing milestones in front of family friends or extended relatives. Each act was calculated to reestablish dominance over the household dynamic and to subtly intimidate both my father and me into compliance. I understood that her behavior was no longer accidental or incidental. It was a concerted effort to regain control and to resist the accountability that had been introduced.
I responded by maintaining vigilance, continuing meticulous documentation of interactions, and reinforcing the patterns of evidence that had supported the initial confrontation. Every dismissive remark, every undermining gesture, and every attempt to diminish Emma's achievements was logged and cataloged, creating a body of evidence that grew stronger with each passing day. It was emotionally exhausting, requiring constant awareness, but I understood that consistency and accuracy were critical. This documentation served not only as proof of repeated behavior, but also as a psychological anchor, reminding me of the importance of persistence and focus in the face of escalating opposition. I was no longer simply observing. I was actively maintaining a record that would support accountability and, ultimately, resolution. The tension also manifested in emotional strain. The home became a place of quiet scrutiny, each action measured and each word weighed for potential impact. Emma, blissfully unaware of the underlying conflict, remained cheerful and curious. But even her laughter was occasionally met with subtle tension when Carla entered the room. I noticed micro-expressions of apprehension in my daughter, slight pauses or hesitations when celebrating small victories, as if she sensed the emotional undercurrents. It could not articulate them. It reinforced the gravity of the situation. This was no longer a matter of personal irritation or family friction, but a critical intervention to safeguard a young child's emotional development. Every interaction carried stakes far beyond ordinary household disagreements. In response, I strategized carefully, maintaining focus on the objective evidence rather than emotional reaction. Each time Carla escalated, I relied on the documented patterns to respond calmly and assertively, ensuring that her actions could be countered without confrontation devolving into personal attacks. This strategy required discipline, patience, and constant mindfulness of the emotional impact on Emma. I sought to create a safe, stable space for her while navigating the mounting pressure from Carla, balancing advocacy, discipline, and emotional support. The process was taxing, yet it reinforced the necessity of structured, evidence-based responses to confrontational behavior, especially when the stakes involved a child's emotional development. As the days progressed, Carla's attempts to reassert control became more visible to my father. He began to take a more active role, reinforcing boundaries and supporting interventions that prioritized Emma's emotional needs. This alignment was crucial, not only for immediate mitigation of the pressure, but also for long-term stability in the household. The combined awareness and vigilance of both parents began to shift the dynamic, reducing the effectiveness of Carla's intimidation and subtle resistance. The pattern was clear. Mounting pressure could be countered with clarity, consistency, and collective accountability, and the presence of undeniable evidence provided leverage that Carla could no longer ignore. The confrontation and subsequent escalation revealed the depth of resistance often encountered when hidden truths are exposed. Carla's behavior demonstrated that acknowledgement alone is insufficient to change entrenched patterns. It must be paired with accountability, consistent boundaries, and clear consequences for continued opposition. The experience highlighted the emotional complexity of family dynamics, illustrating that progress often provokes pushback, particularly when long-standing habits of avoidance, indifference, or control are challenged. I became acutely aware of the emotional labor required to maintain advocacy in such an environment, balancing protection for Emma with strategic responses to mounting resistance.
By the end of this period, the household had entered a stage of sustained tension. Carla's opposition had escalated, the pressure on both Emma and myself was tangible, and the emotional stakes had reached a peak. Yet, amidst this challenge, I felt a growing sense of clarity and resilience. The combination of evidence, strategy, and support from my father created a framework through which the mounting opposition could be managed and ultimately addressed. The confrontation with resistance was not a failure, but a necessary trial, preparing the ground for the inevitable consequences and transformations that would follow.
The story had reached a critical juncture. The pressure was at its highest, the stakes were undeniable, and the path toward resolution, vindication, and emotional restoration was emerging, though it remained fraught with challenge and uncertainty. The days following the escalation of tension quickly became the darkest period of the entire ordeal, a time when the emotional consequences of exposing the truth weighed heavily on every member of the household. Carla's subtle but persistent resistance had grown more overt, and the strain it created began to manifest in ways I had not fully anticipated. The once vibrant atmosphere of our home now felt laden with unspoken conflict and quiet scrutiny, as if every interaction carried the potential to trigger confrontation or emotional fallout. Emma remained blissfully unaware of the tension, but I could sense her sensitivity to the changes in the household energy. The slight pauses before she celebrated small milestones, the careful glances toward Carla, the subtle hesitation in her laughter. The knowledge that she was perceptive to the emotional undercurrents only intensified my own anxiety and sense of responsibility. During this period, I faced a profound internal struggle. Despite having undeniable evidence and my father's support, the emotional toll of continuous opposition was staggering. Each day required vigilance, patience, and the careful management of interactions, while also maintaining my own composure and resilience. The energy required to balance advocacy for Emma with strategic confrontation of Carla's behavior left me physically drained and emotionally stretched. There were moments when I questioned whether the battle was worth the personal cost, whether the disruption and strain in the household might outweigh the benefits of confronting the hidden neglect. These doubts were compounded by fleeting moments of guilt, wondering if my actions would fracture family relationships permanently or create emotional tension that Emma could sense and internalize. Carla's behavior during this lowest point became increasingly manipulative, as though she sensed that the confrontation had shifted power in the household and sought to reclaim it through indirect means. She began making subtle comments that questioned my judgment or motives, often framing them as concern for Emma's well-being, even when they clearly undermined the progress that had been made. These remarks were calculated to provoke self-doubt, to make me question whether I was overreacting, and to destabilize the sense of authority and clarity I had been building through documentation and evidence. The psychological impact of these manipulations was profound. It was not just frustration or anger, it was the realization that exposure alone was not enough to immediately alter behavior, that resistance would continue and might intensify before meaningful change could occur. The home became a battleground of small but significant moments. Simple routines such as feeding, playtime, and bedtime were now fraught with tension. Carla would occasionally ignore Emma's attempts to engage or redirect her attention, subtle acts of emotional neglect that were now impossible to dismiss, but still emotionally painful to witness. Every video or note I had documented became a reminder of both the past pattern and the ongoing struggle. Even with the proof, there was a sense of helplessness in observing behavior in real time and knowing that the emotional consequences for Emma were unfolding daily. The weight of responsibility was nearly overwhelming. I was both witness and protector, navigating the delicate balance of immediate intervention and long-term accountability. During this period, I also faced social isolation, as the emotional intensity of the situation made it difficult to engage casually with friends or extended family. Explaining the situation felt impossible without seeming accusatory or oversensitive, and even minor social interactions carried the risk of emotional spillover. I often found myself replaying interactions in my mind, analyzing Carla's motives, timing, and reactions, searching for additional evidence or patterns, and constantly preparing for the next confrontation. The emotional labor of maintaining vigilance while safeguarding Emma's experiences became all-consuming, leaving little room for personal reprieve or relaxation. It was a lonely, exhausting phase, and the stress often left me questioning whether I could sustain the effort required to see the situation through to resolution. Despite the exhaustion,
I remained steadfast in my purpose, drawing strength from the undeniable proof I had gathered and the support of my father. This period, as dark and emotionally taxing as it was, became a crucible that clarified priorities and sharpened resilience. I realized that the intensity of the challenge was proportional to the significance of the outcome. Protecting Emma's emotional well-being and establishing accountability for behavior that had long been ignored required endurance, courage, and unwavering commitment. The contrast between the darkness of the moment and the clarity of the mission underscored the stakes of the journey and reinforced the necessity of persevering through emotional adversity. In the midst of this lowest point, I also reflected deeply on the lessons embedded in the struggle. I recognized that uncovering and confronting hidden truths is rarely linear or easy, that resistance is often inevitable, and that the emotional fallout may feel unbearable before resolution begins to take hold. I understood that courage in these moments is not the absence of fear or fatigue, but the deliberate decision to act despite them. This realization provided a sense of moral clarity, a reminder that the personal cost of action is outweighed by the consequences of inaction, especially when the well-being of a young child is at stake.
By the end of this period, the household was fraught with tension, emotional exhaustion, and persistent opposition. Carla's resistance was ongoing, the pressure on Emma was tangible, and the psychological toll on myself was profound. Yet within the darkness, there was a growing sense of preparedness, an understanding that the confrontation with the hidden truth had reached its most challenging phase. The stage was set for the final push, the presentation of truth on trial, and the opportunity for accountability, validation, and transformation. The lowest point had arrived, but with it came clarity, determination, and the moral imperative to see the process through to its conclusion. The final push arrived quietly, but with a gravity that demanded full attention. After weeks of observation, documentation, confrontation, and mounting tension, it became clear that the hidden truth had to be brought fully into the open, with no ambiguity or opportunity for denial. The household had reached a point where private confrontations were no longer sufficient. The behavior that had caused emotional strain, manipulation, and subtle neglect needed to be addressed in a setting that allowed for accountability and acknowledgement. I realized that the culmination of evidence, strategy, and perseverance had prepared the ground for this moment. But the stakes were high. Any misstep could reignite conflict, further destabilize the household, or harm Emma emotionally. Despite the pressure, I felt a resolve deeper than any anxiety or fatigue, a determination to ensure that truth would not only be heard, but also validated. I began the day by reviewing the complete archive of evidence one final time. Every video clip, every note, every recorded instance of dismissal or indifference was organized chronologically to illustrate the consistent, undeniable pattern. My goal was to present this material in a structured way, highlighting Emma's achievements and the repeated behaviors that had undermined them. The strategy was simple but essential: maintain calm, focus on objective proof, and center the narrative around Emma's experience rather than personal grievances. The clarity of purpose was empowering. I reminded myself that the confrontation was not about punishment or retribution, but about accountability and emotional restoration. Every clip was a building block, a demonstration that the hidden truth had become visible and that continued neglect could no longer be tolerated. When the moment to present the evidence arrived, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Carla entered the room, initially composed but visibly aware that the dynamic had shifted. My father was present as a supportive witness, his presence reinforcing the need for integrity and accountability in the discussion. I presented the compiled evidence sequentially, beginning with small, seemingly innocuous moments and gradually moving to the most impactful instances. The footage of Emma celebrating milestones while being ignored or dismissed was particularly compelling, showing with visual clarity the emotional impact of Carla's behavior. The cumulative effect of this presentation was undeniable. Each example reinforced the previous, creating a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence, misunderstanding, or exaggeration.
The confrontation unfolded with intensity but also structure. Carla attempted to interject, to rationalize, and to justify her behavior, yet the weight of evidence prevented denial or deflection. Each act of minimization was countered with concrete proof, video clips, chronological notes, and corroborating observations. The deliberate, factual nature of the presentation shifted the focus from opinion to reality, transforming the conversation from argument to accountability. For the first time, the hidden pattern was fully exposed in a way that required acknowledgement, and the emotional gravity of the situation was undeniable. Emma, unaware of the full implications, continued her play nearby, her presence a constant reminder of the stakes and the necessity of advocacy. As the presentation continued, the emotional tone shifted slightly but profoundly. Carla's defensive posture gradually gave way to acknowledgement, first small, hesitant, and then more explicit. The undeniable visual evidence, combined with the structured narrative, forced recognition of the emotional neglect and dismissal that had long been hidden. For my father and I, this represented a breakthrough. The hidden truth was no longer private, subjective, or speculative. It was concrete, undeniable, and incontrovertible. The transformation of the household dynamic, however, required not just acknowledgement, but a commitment to change and consistent accountability moving forward. The public, or at least shared nature of the confrontation, allowed for a recalibration of household norms. Boundaries were reinforced and expectations were clarified. Carla's recognition of the evidence meant that future interactions could no longer ignore Emma's achievements or emotional needs. The discussion also allowed for a framework of repair, where acknowledgement of past neglect was paired with concrete steps to change behavior and foster positive engagement. This was not about punitive measures, but about establishing an environment where Emma could thrive without fear of dismissal or indifference. The accountability was transformative because it shifted the focus from conflict to proactive solutions, creating a space for growth and emotional restoration. In the days following the confrontation, the household atmosphere began to shift subtly. Carla's engagement, while not immediate or perfect, reflected a new level of awareness and responsiveness. Simple acts of acknowledgement, celebrations of milestones, and moments of active involvement began to appear with greater consistency. For Emma, the environment became more emotionally supportive, her laughter and curiosity less interrupted by tension or subtle dismissal. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, and the impact on her well-being was profound. Observing her joy without the shadow of neglect or indifference reinforced the significance of the confrontation and the power of objective evidence in driving meaningful change.
The experience highlighted a critical lesson. The power of truth is magnified when it is documented, presented thoughtfully, and centered on those most affected. Confrontation, when guided by evidence and a clear moral imperative, can lead not to destruction, but to restoration, accountability, and growth. I understood that the weeks of documentation, vigilance, and emotional labor had been a necessary prelude to this moment, preparing the ground for resolution and transformation. The final push had revealed the hidden truth, forced acknowledgement, and created the conditions for sustained change in the household dynamic. By the end of this period, the confrontation had achieved its goal. The hidden pattern of indifference was exposed, the behavior was addressed, and accountability was established. The story had reached its climax, the moment where evidence, courage, and persistence converged to create transformation. Emma's joy and emotional well-being were now visible priorities, and the path toward long-term restoration was clear. The stage was set for the resolution, vindication, and the establishment of a new equilibrium in the household where truth, engagement, and emotional care would form the foundation of everyday life. The resolution of the conflict unfolded gradually, a process of recalibration and reinforcement that transformed the household into a more emotionally supportive environment. Following the confrontation, the undeniable evidence and clear acknowledgement of past neglect provided a foundation for meaningful change. Carla, once resistant and dismissive, now faced a reality that could no longer be ignored, and the dynamic in the home began to shift as a result.
My father and I established boundaries to protect Emma's emotional well-being, ensuring that her milestones, achievements, and small joys were recognized, celebrated, and nurtured consistently. This structure allowed the household to move from a state of tension and uncertainty to one of accountability and clarity, where expectations were clear and the emotional needs of a young child were prioritized above personal grievances or defensive posturing. The process of establishing this new equilibrium required ongoing attention. Carla's engagement with Emma, while improved, remained inconsistent at first, and it became clear that change would not occur overnight. I continued to document interactions, not as a tool for punishment, but as a means of tracking progress and reinforcing patterns of accountability. Each positive act of acknowledgement, each milestone celebrated, and each subtle moment of engagement became a marker of progress, proof that the confrontation had had a lasting impact. This careful observation allowed me to maintain oversight, ensuring that Emma's emotional environment remained protected while also providing Carla with clear expectations and tangible feedback on her behavior. One of the most significant aspects of this resolution was the reinforcement of communication within the household. My father and I worked to establish regular check-ins and discussions to address any concerns before they escalated, creating a framework for ongoing accountability and emotional transparency. This allowed for adjustments in behavior, acknowledgement of lapses, and reinforcement of positive actions, creating a feedback loop that promoted growth and stability. The emphasis on communication and structured oversight reduced the likelihood of repeated neglect or subtle dismissal, ensuring that the changes were not temporary but embedded in the household dynamic. The impact on Emma was immediate and profound. With her milestones and achievements consistently recognized, her confidence and joy flourished. She began exploring new activities with increased enthusiasm, sharing small triumphs with us without hesitation, and expressing herself freely without fear of indifference. The transformation was visible not only in her behavior, but also in her demeanor. The brightness in her eyes, the spontaneous laughter, and the unrestrained curiosity all reflected the emotional security and validation she now experienced. For me, witnessing this growth reinforced the importance of advocacy, the power of objective evidence, and the necessity of persistence in confronting hidden truths. The resolution also had a broader impact on family dynamics beyond the immediate parent-child relationship. Carla's acknowledgement of her behavior and her gradual engagement with Emma allowed for a recalibration of authority and responsibility within the household. Tensions that had previously simmered beneath the surface were now addressed openly, reducing the potential for covert manipulation or subtle undermining. This transparency fostered a healthier environment for all family members, creating a culture of accountability, emotional awareness, and mutual respect. The household, once dominated by subtle conflict and unspoken tension, became a space where intentions were clarified and responsibilities were shared in service of Emma's well-being. Throughout this period, I also observed a personal transformation within myself. The experience had demanded resilience, patience, and unwavering commitment to the truth. I had learned to navigate complex emotional dynamics, maintain clarity in the face of opposition, and prioritize the well-being of a vulnerable child over the discomfort of confrontation. The process of documenting, presenting evidence, and enforcing accountability had strengthened my confidence in my ability to advocate for what was right, even when faced with resistance from someone close to the family. This personal growth was intertwined with the resolution of the household conflict, highlighting the profound ways in which confronting hidden truths can transform not only relationships, but also individual character. As the days and weeks progressed, the household settled into a new rhythm. Celebrations of Emma's milestones became consistent and genuine. Interactions were infused with acknowledgement and engagement, and the tension that had defined the previous months gradually dissipated. The emotional environment became stable, predictable, and nurturing, allowing Emma to thrive, while also fostering a sense of security and mutual respect among all family members. The resolution was not simply the cessation of conflict, it was the establishment of a positive, accountable, and emotionally supportive dynamic that could sustain long-term growth and well-being.
By the end of this period, the transformation was unmistakable. The hidden neglect that had previously shaped the household dynamic had been exposed, confronted, and addressed. Accountability had been established, emotional needs were prioritized, and a culture of recognition and engagement replaced subtle indifference. Emma's joy, confidence, and sense of security reflected the success of this resolution, and the household as a whole had moved toward a healthier, more harmonious equilibrium. The experience underscored the power of persistence, evidence-based advocacy, and moral courage, demonstrating that hidden truths, once exposed, can lead to meaningful change, validation, and restored emotional balance. The stage was now set for the final part of the story, where the transformation would be fully realized and Emma's experience, and the lessons learned, would be cemented into a new life of purpose, validation, and hope. The transformation that followed the resolution became visible not only in the household dynamic, but also in the subtle ways Emma's life began to reflect joy, confidence, and security that had been absent for far too long. Each morning, she greeted the day with an unrestrained curiosity, her laughter no longer tempered by hesitation or apprehension. Her achievements, first steps, first words, small accomplishments at play, were celebrated with genuine enthusiasm, creating a feedback loop of encouragement and emotional reinforcement that enriched both her development and our shared family experience. The energy in the home shifted palpably, where once there had been tension, subtle indifference, and quiet battles over recognition and attention, there was now warmth, engagement, and a sense of collective accountability. This transformation was neither immediate nor effortless, but its presence was undeniable and profoundly reassuring. The emotional growth extended beyond Emma. I observed a renewed sense of responsibility and attentiveness in my father, whose active engagement and consistent support reinforced the household's new equilibrium. He became a steady anchor for both Emma and myself, reinforcing boundaries, encouraging positive interactions, and modeling the kind of attentive, nurturing behavior that was essential to sustaining the transformation. Carla, though still adjusting to the acknowledgement of her previous indifference, began to participate more consistently in Emma's life, offering moments of engagement and support that were genuine, if tentative at first. While not all behaviors had changed overnight, the trajectory was clear. The household had shifted from one marked by subtle neglect and unspoken tension to one guided by accountability, recognition, and emotional care. Emma's personal growth was the most striking indicator of transformation. Her confidence flourished as she experienced consistent acknowledgement and emotional support. Simple milestones such as balancing on her first scooter or learning to stack blocks higher than ever before were celebrated with laughter and affirmation, creating a feedback loop of encouragement and emotional reinforcement that enriched both her development and our shared family experience. The energy in the home shifted palpably, where once there had been tension, subtle indifference, and quiet battles over recognition and attention, there was now warmth, engagement, and a sense of collective accountability. This transformation was neither immediate nor effortless, but its presence was undeniable and profoundly reassuring. The emotional growth extended beyond Emma. I observed a renewed sense of responsibility and attentiveness in my father, whose active engagement and consistent support reinforced the household's new equilibrium. He became a steady anchor for both Emma and myself, reinforcing boundaries, encouraging positive interactions, and modeling the kind of attentive, nurturing behavior that was essential to sustaining the transformation. Carla, though still adjusting to the acknowledgement of her previous indifference, began to participate more consistently in Emma's life, offering moments of engagement and support that were genuine, if tentative at first. While not all behaviors had changed overnight, the trajectory was clear. The household had shifted from one marked by subtle neglect and unspoken tension to one guided by accountability, recognition, and emotional care.
Emma's personal growth was the most striking indicator of transformation. Her confidence flourished as she experienced consistent acknowledgement and emotional support. Simple milestones such as balancing on her first scooter or learning to stack blocks higher than ever before were celebrated with laughter and affirmation, creating a feedback loop of encouragement and emotional reinforcement that enriched both her development and our shared family experience. The energy in the home shifted palpably, where once there had been tension, subtle indifference, and quiet battles over recognition and attention, there was now warmth, engagement, and a sense of collective accountability. This transformation was neither immediate nor effortless, but its presence was undeniable and profoundly reassuring. The broader impact of this transformation extended beyond Emma's immediate experiences. Carla's gradual engagement and acknowledgement, reinforced by consistent boundaries and oversight, illustrated that accountability paired with structured support can foster meaningful behavioral change even in those previously resistant to reflection or adjustment. My father's active role in maintaining equilibrium further reinforced the lesson that support and shared responsibility are essential to sustaining transformation. The household became a model of how honesty, courage, and structured intervention can reshape relationships, restore emotional balance, and foster long-term well-being for the most vulnerable members of a family. As the weeks and months progressed, the household settled into a rhythm that reinforced the lessons learned and the growth achieved. Emma's achievements continued to be celebrated, her curiosity and confidence flourished, and the emotional climate of the home remained stable and supportive. The tension and resistance that had once dominated the environment faded into memory, replaced by proactive engagement, accountability, and genuine connection. The transformation was now embedded in the structure, communication patterns, and emotional culture of the household, providing a sustainable foundation for future growth and development.
Ultimately, the story culminated in a profound realization: the power of truth, when pursued with courage, documented thoroughly, and presented with clarity, can transform not only individual relationships, but also the environment that shapes a young child's life. Emma's newfound confidence, joy, and sense of security stood as a living testament to the impact of advocacy, accountability, and persistence. The journey from hidden neglect to recognized, celebrated milestones highlighted the enduring value of moral courage, strategic action, and unwavering commitment to the well-being of those most vulnerable. The final image of our transformed household was one of empowerment and hope. Emma's laughter filled the rooms freely, milestones were met with celebration, and the energy in the home reflected the sustained impact of truth, advocacy, and accountability. The household had evolved into a space of recognition, engagement, and emotional safety. And the lessons learned from this experience now shaped the ongoing approach to parenting, family dynamics, and personal growth. The story concluded not merely with resolution, but with the full realization of transformation. A young child thriving in a supportive environment, a family recalibrated around accountability and care, and a profound reminder that truth, when courageously pursued, has the power to reshape lives, relationships, and futures. The final stage of the journey revealed a transformation that extended far beyond the mere resolution of conflict. It was a complete recalibration of the emotional landscape of our household. Emma, once navigating her early milestones with hesitancy and subtle apprehension, now moved through her days with an unshakable sense of confidence and joy. Her first steps had become more than a physical achievement. They symbolized the persistence, care, and advocacy that had been necessary to protect her growth and emotional well-being. Each morning, she greeted the day with enthusiasm, exploring her surroundings with curiosity untempered by the invisible tension that had once clouded the home. The atmosphere, once heavy with subtle manipulation and quiet resistance, had transformed into one where laughter and recognition were constant companions, reinforcing the lessons of perseverance and accountability that had carried us to this point. The process of establishing this equilibrium required more than the confrontation of neglect or the presentation of evidence. It demanded the ongoing cultivation of consistency and trust.
Every milestone Emma achieved was met with genuine acknowledgement, whether it was mastering a new word, successfully stacking blocks, or discovering a new skill during play. The deliberate celebration of her achievements served as reinforcement not only for her confidence, but also for the household's new standard of engagement. It created an environment in which Emma could internalize her sense of value and belonging, where emotional security was no longer conditional on the whims of others, but embedded into the fabric of daily life. This consistency was crucial. It signaled to her that recognition and support were reliable, reinforcing a stable emotional foundation that would support her growth long after this story had unfolded. The personal transformation for myself and my father was equally significant. Navigating the months of conflict, documentation, confrontation, and tension had honed our ability to respond strategically and with moral clarity, even in the face of resistance. We had learned that patience and consistency, guided by objective evidence, were essential in establishing meaningful change, particularly when dealing with someone resistant to accountability. It deepened our empathy, strengthened our resolve, and instilled a profound understanding of the ways in which courage and persistence can create tangible impact on the lives of others. The lessons extended beyond parenting. They became principles for navigating life's hidden challenges, demonstrating that confronting truth, no matter how uncomfortable, can yield outcomes far greater than avoidance or compromise. Carla's behavior, once marked by dismissal and subtle undermining, gradually shifted in response to the structural changes we had implemented. While not instantaneous, her engagement became increasingly consistent and genuine, providing moments of support and acknowledgement that had been absent before. These acts of involvement were small but significant, each one reinforcing the household's new pattern of accountability and care. The shift was a reminder that transformation is often gradual and requires sustained reinforcement. Yet, even tentative steps toward acknowledgement can contribute meaningfully to a healthier, more supportive environment. The household, once dominated by unspoken tension and passive resistance, now reflected the cumulative effect of courage, evidence, and persistence. Emma's progress highlighted the broader implications of these changes. Her ability to navigate challenges with confidence, express joy freely, and engage with her environment without hesitation reflected the protective and nurturing atmosphere we had worked to establish. Milestones, once overshadowed by subtle neglect, now became celebrations of growth and capability, teaching her the value of persistence, recognition, and emotional security. These experiences would serve as the foundation for her self-esteem and relational skills in the years to come, illustrating that the impact of advocacy and accountability extends far beyond immediate circumstances. The culmination of this transformation demonstrated that confronting hidden truths, when paired with patience and consistent care, can fundamentally reshape the developmental trajectory of a young child. The household as a whole had entered a state of sustained equilibrium, one in which emotional safety, acknowledgement, and accountability were prioritized. Daily interactions reflected the shift: attention to Emma's achievements, engagement in play, and affirmation of her emotional needs became habitual rather than reactive. Communication between adults was clearer and more purposeful, boundaries were respected, and the household operated within a framework that reinforced consistency, mutual respect, and emotional growth. The tension and uncertainty that had characterized previous months gave way to predictability, warmth, and collaboration, providing a stable environment for Emma and reducing the emotional labor previously required to maintain oversight. Reflecting on the entirety of this journey, it became clear that the power of truth, courage, and persistence extended beyond confrontation. The process had revealed the ways in which evidence-based advocacy, sustained effort, and moral clarity can reshape relationships, environments, and futures. Emma's thriving presence, Carla's gradual engagement, and the father's steady involvement all converged to create a household that not only survived conflict, but emerged stronger, more resilient, and more capable of nurturing growth. The experience underscored that transformation is rarely instantaneous, that accountability requires reinforcement, and that the well-being of the most vulnerable members is the guiding principle around which meaningful change must be organized. In the final analysis, the story concluded not with a single triumphant moment, but with the lived reality of a transformed life.
Emma's laughter echoed through the rooms, her curiosity and confidence were unrestrained, and the energy of the household reflected the culmination of months of effort, persistence, and courage. The transformation was complete, a home in which truth had been confronted, accountability had been established, and emotional support had become the norm. The final image was one of hope, empowerment, and lasting change. A young child flourishing in a secure, nurturing environment, and a family transformed by the deliberate pursuit of truth and justice. The lessons of this journey, embedded in every interaction, celebration, and milestone, would continue to shape the household for years to come, serving as a testament to the enduring power of courage, persistence, and unwavering commitment to the well-being of those we love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.